Hello, this is Laren. Happy Friday. I'm here with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today we're going to take a look at some maps. Occasionally I will do some random map challenges just to keep kind of brushed up on my skills so I don't forget how to do the maps, especially if I'm going to be showing it live like this. It's kind of nice to have a connection with the tools and stuff and not be so out of date and also forget a lot of the things that I've learned. So what I'm going to do is bring in a map that I made from a third-party tool outside of Fantasy Grounds, and then we're going to put some line of sight if required. I don't think this particular map's going to need a lot, but nonetheless, if you're already in Fantasy Grounds and you want to import an image of any sort, you can come over to the right-hand side where the assets are. I'm going to go ahead and put on my pointer so that way you can get a better idea of what I'm pointing at. And then also, if I need to show any third-party tools or anything like that, I'll do so. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my tools, but as you can see, I got the pointer out here, so it'll be a little easier to see. So I'm going to go to my hard drive, and as you can see, I got some images here that are from various sources and such, and I've got some of the stuff, I've generated some of the stuff with some AI. Anyhow, I'm going to take this content here, and I'm going to move it into Fantasy Grounds, so you can either do this one image at a time. In this case, I'm going to take the entire folder and copy it, because these are all set up for Fantasy Grounds, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And what you want to do is over here on the right in your assets folder, you want to open that up. This is where you manage your tokens, portraits, and images. So the tokens are basically what goes on your NPCs and your players on the left-hand side, or excuse me, on the right-hand side. The portraits are what goes on the left-hand side, so that would be stuff like your, pictures of your PC and such. And images is everything else. So that can be handouts, maps, diagrams, whatever. So right now I don't have a campaign folder for this particular campaign. That's because I haven't placed any sort of artwork or anything extraneous other than what already comes with Fantasy Grounds. So what I'm going to do is click on the folder on the bottom here, on the bottom toolbar, and that's going to open up the back end of Fantasy Grounds where this actual directory is for Fantasy Grounds in the assets for the images. So I'm going to hit Control V because I already have that folder copied, and I just called it Snowbound Adventures because it's themed for snow and ice. And if I double click on this, this gives me all the images that I had showed you earlier. So to take this a step further, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another subfolder. So in here, I'm going to take maps as one. And then for the other, I'll do handouts. So I'm going to do two folders. So new folder, and we'll call the other one handouts. So this is kind of to help differentiate what types of data are in which folders, and it makes it a little bit more organized. So I'm going to go ahead and left click and drag just the maps into the maps folder, and then all the rest are going to go in the handouts area. And that's just for organizational purposes. There's something else I want to mention here that's kind of critical and important if you're going to be doing a big project in Fantasy Grounds. I mean, if you're only bringing in one image, probably not a big deal, but if you notice here, you actually can put the title of the file in kind of a format so that when you import it into Fantasy Grounds, it's a lot easier. So this is kind of critical. This is something that you want to potentially practice as you get used to Fantasy Grounds, and you want to use the map tools or the assets, and you're bringing in your own. You want to organize them in such a way that's a little bit easier to find. So we still don't have a data folder yet. So if I go back to the main folder here and check out the handouts, as you can see, I've named all these with a certain name. I took about 5 or 10 sets. What that does is Fantasy Grounds rescans this folder and the subfolders, and it'll say folder assets refreshed. And now you actually have this bag here, which is the directory for this campaign for the images. So if I click on that, there's my Snowbound Adventures folder. If I click on that, there's the handouts and the maps. So in this case, I'm going to click on maps, and then now I have 4 different maps that I can pick from. So rather than opening these up one at a time and that sort of thing, if you want to include all the images at once instead of just dragging one over at a time, because you can go to your campaign area, go to images, and then you could drag these assets over into the section if you want, one at a time. And that's great if you only have like 1 or 2 files. But in this case, I have several. So what I'm going to want to do is first I'm going to make a category or a group here. And then I just click this green plus button. Now I'm going to click the edit button, which allows me to change the name. So I'll call this Snowbound Adventures just because I don't have a good title or any specific reason to give it a specific name. So Snowbound Adventures. So that's just an area or descriptor of this directory, or in this case, this is a group of images that I want to put in one group. So it's kind of like a filter. So now that I have that filter, what I have the option for up here is I can go to the store and get assets. I can create assets from the campaign assets. I can pull in all the images at once. So all these plus anything else in this campaign folder. Or I can import files one at a time. So if I click on that, I can just, if I had images scattered all over my hard drive, that'd be another way to do it. So what I'm going to do now is going to just click on Create from Campaign Assets. Fantasy Grounds will scan through everything that I've added, and then it will add it here to this list at once. The beauty of this is if you have a large project and you've already worked on all of your images, you have them named, you have them organized, then at the very end, you'll click on this Create from Campaign Assets, which will allow you to import in all of your changes and all the artwork that you've worked on. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. It gives me a warning. It says, are you sure you want to do this? And say, yep. So as soon as I do that, what happens here is it's going to pull in all of these different images. So what I have here now is, as you can see, I have handouts, maps, and these are NPCs at the bottom. So that really helps sort out the list of what you have in your directories. And this helps with organizational. So when I come over here and I want to see something, I go, oh, okay, there's the, there's basically the hierarchy, the order. And now I know that the maps are down here and it's sorted out. I don't have to make a separate group. The only time I'd make a separate group if I wanted to sort the maps from the images and such is if this list goes further than this. So in other words, if it's this list, if I have to expand it out and it has different page numbers, I think that's time to kind of split that out into different groups. If it's a small one-shot adventure and you only got a few images, you probably don't need that. So you'll find that in a lot of modules, they'll have separated maps for the GMs, the players, the backgrounds, and all that kind of thing. But in this case, I have them all in one folder. But by naming them a certain type of name, that makes it come out in an alphabetical order. And I see I misspelled one here. So if you're going to make changes like this, you want to do it now before you actually start linking stuff together. You don't want to change file names after you've already had it linked up to a bunch of different things within your campaign. So I'm going to go back to the back end, and I'm going to find that map that has the incorrect title. Yeah, it says handout. I like it. The way I spelt it was crazy. Yeah, so there's an extra letter in there. So hand out. Okay, so I'm just going to fix the spelling there. And now it reshuffles. And then I'm going to go ahead and refresh the folder assets. And then I have to delete this one because it's actually changed. And this is how things get broken if you don't go back and fix that. So, and then I'm going to go into the actual Snowbound thing, go to the handouts, and I believe it was this one. Yeah, the Spire. I believe this is it. Okay, let's see. Handout, 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 Spire 1, Spire 2. Yeah. So it's just the one that I had to fix. But as you see, I do all this before you actually link everything together. Because once you start linking stuff together, like an image to a story entry, or you got story entries linked to a map, if you change the name or the file location or anything like that, and after you hit this refresh button, it's going to break that link if you don't go back and fix that. So, and you have to fix it all the way through. So even if you fix it here, it's not going to necessarily fix it throughout the whole adventure. You actually have to go and relink it and everything else in most cases. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're playing around with your assets in the background of Fantasy Grounds, is that if you make any changes on the back end where this folder is, and you change file names and you move stuff around, and if you already have it in this state and it's already linked to a bunch of stuff, you're potentially undoing your work or breaking it. So you have to go back and fix those. So that's why I suggest getting this all taken care of before you start linking stuff together, because that's when it really gets frustrating. So now that I have that out of the way, I wanted to explain that because that's an important thing that does come up sometimes. Like if you bring up a map that's the name has been changed for some reason, when you bring that image up, all you're going to see is a question mark, and that's going to confuse you. Sometimes that will happen when Fantasy Grounds does an update. Occasionally, the file names and the directories get changed. So if that's the case, and you're experiencing this when you're using Fantasy Grounds with a store-bought module or adventure or accessory, you want to go to modules, if there is any, and you right-click on it, and you click on Revert Changes. And what that'll do is update that data structure, and it will bring it back to 0 or back to where it should be, and it will fix all the mistakes that it had in the background. So this is if you've already purchased the module, you've been using it, and then Fantasy Grounds has a major update, or maybe there's some images they want to add or update in the back end. If you already have this adventure activated, you're already using it, and you've made some changes to it, if you hit that revert, it's going to reset the module back to 0. So just remember that. If you've made any changes, like you put your own links in there, it'll reset those. So just kind of keep that in mind. So I'm just going to load the SRD just so I have something to show you. So I'm just going to load just the basic SRD. This is for a 5th edition rule set. So this tutorial, these things that I'm showing you are universal throughout all maps in Fantasy Grounds. So this isn't just a D&D thing. So if I go back and I hit right click, and here is the revert changes, and if you click on that, it'll kind of fix everything and reshuffle it. And if you've already made changes, you already had this module loaded, it may give you some grief before you even try to update or fix anything. So just be careful with that. So just because you update the module in the back end doesn't necessarily mean that the things that you've done to it or the things that you have changed for your campaign have taken yet. So until you refresh it, it's not going to necessarily reflect the changes that were made on the other end. So hopefully that makes sense. Sounds like a lot of double talk, but essentially when you update Fantasy Grounds, sometimes the modules update, and if you're in the middle of adventure and you start seeing question marks and such, go to the adventure, right click, go to revert changes, but keep in mind that you will lose any of your personal changes that you've added to any of those maps or the module itself. All right, so the next thing is going to be to create some line of sight or even just some shadowing or effects. So there are a few maps here. So here's like a layer map, which I thought would be kind of fun to play with. There's a kind of a ruins type map here. They're all very similar. I think that these two are probably the better ones. The other one, this third one, is like a henge, which isn't too bad. So they're all very similar in scope. And the other one is, let's see, we have a layer, ruins, and then we have another layer. So this one's a little bit more manufactured, or as you can see, it's got more stonework. So what I'm going to do is just pick one of these. So let's go with, actually I like this one down here. So this is just going to be a random map that I'm going to work on. And for right now, time being, it kind of looks like there isn't going to be a ton of line of sight. But what we have here is kind of like an island in the middle of a lake. And this is frozen around here, so you can kind of walk across that, but underneath there is water. So I'm probably going to use the water effect to kind of give it that kind of movement that I'm looking for. And then it's when you're working on a map in Fantasy Grounds, you want to scale or move this frame where you can see what you're doing. And then you can right click and go to view, and you can do zoom to fill or zoom to fit, or you can use this drop down up here on the top and do the same thing. This is zoom to fit up here. So you can do the same thing to recenter the map and to kind of get it, situated where you want to fix it. And it looks like to me there's not going to be a ton of things I need to do, probably just some terrain. So as far as height go, I'm going to assume that these stones up here, these upper ones, are likely going to be taller than a person. So I'd probably, or just even like 10 feet or something like that. So I'll probably put some terrain on there. And then for the smaller stuff, I'll leave that. I don't really need to do anything with it. But this relief here, this thing, and probably the smaller one over here, I'll put like glass or I'll put a window around it so that way people can walk up to it and they can see it, but they won't be able to necessarily move through it unless they climb it. So that's just something that you're going to have to check out. So I'm going to take a quickie and we'll be right back. All right, so what we're going to do is put in some line of sight around the larger stonework here. So generally, we start with the line of sight tool, click on the map itself, which is this base image. That's the layer. And then I'm going to take this Christmas tree terrain tool and just kind of click around. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just kind of click around these areas. So I'm going to go to the line tool and just kind of put in a little bit of terrain, doesn't have to be perfect, and just kind of go through here, get the rough shape of the actual rock formation. You don't have to do anything fancy here, just so this is just a preliminary kind of course through this. And as you can see, I'm not going right to the edge. It's not necessary. Matter of fact, it doesn't look too good if you go right to the edge. The only time I ever do that is if maybe it's a work column. Okay. And then this is basically how this is going to play out when I go through and do all this line of sight here. This is just a terrain tool, so this blocks the light. It doesn't block movement, so that people can still move on there. They just won't be able to see it. So that's something you'll have to negotiate. But nonetheless, this is just a preliminary way to do this. Really not a quick way, but it doesn't take that long. And if you're not explaining it, you're actually focusing on it. It's not really that. It doesn't take that long. Okay, so that's basically just the pillars. What I want to do on something like this is I should have put the grid on it. So I'm just going to turn it on for right now and take a look at that. So this isn't really exactly the type of, let me look at maybe putting 30 in here. Yeah, so 30 is pretty good number for this particular map. So, and then the grayed out area for the maps themselves, the grid, I want to go ahead and turn on the color picker. I'm going to go to like a yellow so it kind of stands out more. It is kind of god awful, but I'm going to turn it down so it's not so obnoxious. There we go. So that will essentially be just like the basic grid and some of the line of sight. In play mode, I can start turning on these different things. I can see I can't see anything from this standpoint. And that's because I don't have a token on here, and none of the assets that I have in here have any sort of light at all. So I'm going to go to lighting, and I'll turn off these temporarily until I can get the lighting set up. So I'm going to go to lighting, and I'm going to do all the outdoor lighting, which is going to be the ambient light. So I'll go to ambient lighting, and then I'm going to go ahead and do a dusk type thing here, which is going to add kind of like the, like sunlight's still there, but it's kind of going down. And then you can change the direction of shadows and that sort of thing. But let me go back and turn that stuff on so we can see it. So here's dusk. And then if you go back to the lighting tool and go back to the ambient light, you can see the shadows moving on here. So we can extend the length of the shadow a little bit. So I think about 15 is pretty good, because that'll show the length. And then let's take a look at the direction. So I'm going to make the direction of the shadow kind of match the shadowing that's already there. So there's some shadow already built in, so I'm going to try to match that. And there we go. So I think about 25 is good for shadow length. And then you can change the color if you want. You can turn it on or off from here. So that's basically the shadow that comes off the rocks when the sun is setting. And you can kind of see that when you move that around. So that's that. Now, if you want to really test this with tokens, you want to find an NPC or some kind of thing. So I'll use this acolyte. I always use this same old priest guy every time, just so I know. He doesn't have any lighting, doesn't have a torch, doesn't have night vision or dark vision. So I'm going to drag his token, put him on the map, and when I claim this token, that's basically what the players will see when they're looking at it. If I click on it again, that deselects. It means I'm kind of looking at it as a GM from an overview. And once you click on a token, whether it's a player or NPC, as the host or the GM, this is what you're going to see. So that's how you test it out. You come around and take a look. So what I'm going to do on these smaller ones, since they're not as tall, or not, or maybe they are. So I'm going to go back to this line of sight tool and go back into the line tool, and I'm going to just add this little bit more, and that should take care of it. All right, so there we go. There's that, and that should do it. And then this little guy right here, like I said, I might use glass. So I put a window here. So even though it's not blocking light and the players can still see it, what this does is it makes it so they can't move through it. unless you undo it. So I'll do the same thing with this one over here. These are pretty significant. They're not small. They probably come up to like your chest or something like that. So I think that's a good use for that. But other than that, everything else has got the this tool on there. And so unless the player climbs up on top, they're not going to see this. So if I bring this guy over here, you know, he comes up here, you can see all around. But if he moves around this thing, it's being blocked by the rock, which is what the illusion of that shadowing is. So that's what that's all about there. So this really isn't a whole like fancy map or anything, but I am going to put an effect on it. So I want to come over here and I want to put on the effects tool, go to effects layer, and I'm going to put on the water effect. And I'm going to temporarily turn off the line of sight. And then when you have this water tool, it'll go over the entire map. So I'm going to put a mask on it, which will only show the parts I want to reveal. So to do a trace around here to unmask some of this area, I'm just going to left click and drag just to get the bulk of this area taken care of. And then when I get closer to the, oops, I didn't want to do that. When I get closer to the actual map or to the rocks, I'll go ahead and change that. I'll hold the control key down, and that should take care of it. So hit the control key, and you can draw, or excuse me, it's the alt key. So you can draw around. You don't have to have just squares. This is how you do it freehanded. Hold down this alt key, and that will free up this area. So this is basically trapped water underneath the ice. So that's why I put this effect on. Okay, so that looks a little better having the water on there. The only thing I don't care for is that these shadows kind of block some of that. So that's intended. I mean, you want it to do that, but it kind of takes away some of the effects from the other things that are in here. But it's a point of view thing. So when the player's moving around, they're not supposed to be able to see through that. But if they come up to the edge of the water, they'll see that movement. So, but this is actually ice, so they can move through that. But there's water underneath that's moving. So that ice is probably only a few feet thick at the most. And on a clear day, you probably see them towards the bottom of this lake or whatever this pond is. So that's just a quick, dirty way to put this in. Like I said, this glass won't let you move through these pillars, but you can still see through them. So that's a creative way to use the tools to help you block certain elements that you want the players still to see, but you don't want them just cut right through it. They have to talk to you about it, like climb up on top or something like that. And then you can open it up. Once you click open, they can move through it. But that's just a really quick way to do this. So this is a real simple map. This isn't very complex, so maybe not much of a show. But the stuff I talked about before about managing the images, naming them, putting them in the folders in the back end, that's really important stuff. And don't rename the files. If you have to, you can rename it up here on the top left, but it doesn't change the name of the file on the back end. It just changes it in Fantasy Grounds. So the other thing you can do is if you didn't want this to show up, map 4 Isle Henge, you can unidentify the map and just call it Lake Island or something like that until they explore it more, and then you can tell them the real name of this place. That way, if it says Boss Lair over here, they're not, they're not going to know that until it's time. So you can do that, and what that does is when you share the map, you do that by sharing any image in Fantasy Grounds. You just right click, go to sharing, and then share record, and that pushes the map to your players. So when that happens, they'll only see this title. They won't see the actual file name or the actual name of the map, because sometimes it'll give it away. Like it might say Goblin Boss Lair or something like that. So I don't know how many times I've accidentally shared something, or like, oh, this is the boss's house. I'm like, oh crap, I forgot to change that. So name your files beforehand is what I'm get kind of the lesson here. And the other thing is, when you have this map here, if you're going to be using it quite a bit, you can left click and drag and put it down in your hotkeys. So the next time you need it, it's going to be easily found and easily accessible. The other thing is to change this shape and the size of this grid, or the size of this frame here for the map. And the reason for that is, like, when you're using Fantasy Grounds, whenever you first open something, it's always going to open in the middle. So it's better if you take that asset, whatever it might be, and move it to where you want it to move, or where you want it to be opened in the next instance. So if I close this, now that I have it placed and sized, if I click on the shortcut again, it's going to save that information for me. So that makes it easier to bring it back up. And it also, you'll know where it's going to be. Because when you open a new window, like I haven't opened items yet. So whenever you open something new like this, it's going to always open in the center. That's where they're anchored to when you first initially click on them. But if you actually move this somewhere and left click and drag it and size it, the next time this comes up and I need it again and I click on items, it's going to be right there. So that's a really big thing in Fantasy Grounds for managing windows, is if you don't want 50,000 windows all over the place and you kind of want them to be organized, just open up all your windows ahead of time, place them where you want them to go and size them, and then close them. And the next time you open them up, they will go where you want them to go and not right smack dab in the center. You can't help that with your initial click, when you first do it, but after that first time, you can move it, resize it, put it where you want, and then close it. What I normally see is if somebody was working in Fantasy Grounds, and let's say they have this NPC, right? So they'll leave it here in the middle, and they might resize it a little, and they might even stick it, over here, and then they'll close it. And the next time you bring up that aboleth, that creature, I'll go back to bring this up, it's going to go where you left it. So try to leave it in a spot where it's not going to be covering everything. So I usually put all my NPCs and players right next to the combat tracker. And I do the same thing for maps. So when you're using maps, you can layer them on top of each other. You can only use one map at a time anyway. So you can actually take two different maps and layer them together until you need them. And you can actually close them. And then when it's time, you open it up, and all the space behind this is reserved for the map. So this section here would be for your player character sheets or your reference. Down here at the bottom could be where you put your story entries or your notes. And then you have a spot for everything or most things, and that way it makes it much easier to run the game. If you're going to constantly be opening up new windows like this one, I'd probably have that here. When you open up new windows, they're always going to be in the middle. So what you can do in the beginning is, let's say this modules folder, maybe you want this over here all the time. So when you open this up, it's going to be in the same spot every time. So this is what I do to kind of make it so I have an idea of where things are going to open, and they're not going to cover stuff in the middle of play. So like this encounters, I might do that, put that there. All I'm doing is taking the data windows and placing them where I want before I leave the table. So same thing. Anytime something new comes up, it's gonna come up mostly in that one corner up there on top. So here's tables. I haven't opened that up, but basically I want these to open where I asked them to. So I don't want them to open up right in the middle of the screen when I'm trying to run the game. So that's a thing that you can do to help yourself when it comes to running anything in Fantasy Grounds, any rule set, is you can have this sort of organization, so you're not going to go through all this nightmare of fighting the interface and everything else. So anyways, I think I'll go. I think this has been long enough. It's been about a half an hour. You guys have a good weekend. This is just a kind of a quick little tutorial video. I was just in the middle of working on a campaign type thing, and I wanted to share that little bit of information. So you take care, everyone, and hopefully, yeah, no problem, Agent Covenant. Yeah, it's just once in a while, I'll just turn the stream on and go for it. Normally, I'm just kind of doing this by myself in the background. I don't really get a chance to explain what I'm doing and share this with people because it's something that I think is important to see how the product is used. And this is just one way to use it. You can do it any way you like, but this is kind of a tried and true method. So you take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.